September 1, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburō Sakai sat beneath the humid canvas of the operations tent, scanning an intelligence report through his single remaining eye. The other had been ruined by American gunfire a year earlier. What he read made him laugh. A new American fighter, heavy as a bomber and shaped like a transport, supposedly meant to challenge the Zero. They called it the Hellcat. According to the report, it weighed nearly twice as much as the A6M. To Sakai, it was proof the Americans still didn't understand air combat. Through the tent flaps he could see the line of Zeros shimmering in the heat, sleek and perfectly balanced. For 2 years, those fighters had dominated every opponent they met: British Hurricanes, American P-42s, Dutch Buffaloes. All had fallen before the maneuverability and range of Japan's premier aircraft. This new American machine, bloated and inelegant, seemed destined to meet the same fate. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the pilots at Rabaul knew, was that in a single month, that overweight fighter would begin dismantling everything they believed about aerial warfare. In the months ahead, the Hellcat would claim thousands of victories, averaging nearly 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every one lost. It would help erase Japan's veteran pilot corps, reshape carrier warfare, and expose the foundation on which the Zero's early success had rested: elite pilots, outdated enemy aircraft, and assumptions that no longer matched the reality of 1943. Japan's confidence that September wasn't empty bravado, it came from cold numbers. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had achieved kill ratios that looked impossible. 9 Zeros lost at the Philippines for more than 100 American aircraft destroyed. Only a handful lost over Darwin against dozens of Allied planes. Entire air forces in Southeast Asia collapsed in days. At the center of this dominance was the A6M Zero, a fighter that had stunned American engineers when captured models were examined. Its range matched that of some bombers. Its turn rate outclassed nearly everything in the sky. Its construction, using a secret lightweight alloy, allowed astonishing agility. It was an aircraft that felt alive in a pilot's hands. What made the Zero extraordinary also revealed the philosophy behind it. The Japanese removed anything not essential to performance. Armor plate, self-sealing tanks, even radios were stripped out whenever possible. Every ounce saved went into maneuverability. American pilots joked that the Zero was made of beer cans, but they learned quickly that this fragile aircraft could dance through the sky like nothing they had ever faced. Against that backdrop, early reports of the F6F Hellcat were easy for Japanese analysts to dismiss. It was massive, heavily armored, carried large amounts of ammunition, and used a thick radial engine. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactician who masterminded Pearl Harbor, reviewed the numbers himself and found them laughable. He believed the Zero would outturn it, outclimb it, and embarrass it. On paper, he wasn't wrong. The Hellcat's wing loading and weight suggested it should be helpless in a dogfight. Everything about its design contradicted Japan's principles of aerial combat. Yet the battlefield was already changing, and the Japanese didn't see it. Their assumptions still revolved around turn fighting, tight circles at low speeds, battles decided by agility. The Americans, meanwhile, are moving toward a new style of combat built on speed, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. The Hellcat wasn't designed to match the Zero in its dance. It was designed to end the dance entirely. And the first hints of this shift appeared at the end of September 1943, when Japanese pilots encountered an unfamiliar dark blue fighter above Marcus Island. One pilot, Yoshio Fukui, mistook them at first for bombers. Then the shapes turned, revealing a broad fuselage and short wings. He tried the classic Zero tactic: roll into a tight, diving turn and swing behind the enemy. But the Hellcat didn't follow the script. Instead of turning, it climbed straight upward on sheer engine power. Fukui tried to follow, but his Zero bled speed and stalled. The Hellcat pivoted in a controlled hammerhead and came down on him with 6 guns blazing. Fukui escaped by miracle. His wingman did not. The shock lingered, but Rabaul's pilots still believed they could adapt. They thought the encounter was an anomaly. They didn't yet understand they had just glimpsed the beginning of the end. October 5, 1943. Wake Island. 12 Zeros lifted off to intercept another American raid, nothing unusual. For months, carrier-based attacks had come and gone, often vanishing before Japanese fighters could bring them to battle. But this time, the Americans weren't running. As the Zeros climbed into the sunlight, their pilots saw 12 dark blue fighters cruising below them in tight, disciplined formation. Hellcats. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led the Japanese division. With altitude advantage, perfect positioning, and veteran pilots on his side, he expected the usual outcome. Their dive began with confidence, yet when the attack unfolded, the Japanese pilots faced something they had never seen. The Hellcats neither scattered nor panicked. They didn't try to turn and duel. Instead, they held energy, dipped into a shallow dive, and absorbed the Zero's opening burst as if the gunfire were nothing more than falling rain. Their armor, hundreds of pounds of it, soaked damage that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. When the Zeros pulled up to reset for a second attack, the Hellcats were already climbing. They used the one thing their weight had given them, momentum. At higher altitude, the Americans carried far more power than the Zeros could produce. Up in the thinner air where the Nakajima engines struggled, the Hellcats still surged forward with tremendous strength. Then the counterattack came, swift, brutal, and coordinated. Minimal turning, maximum velocity, slashing passes instead of dogfights, 6 guns firing a storm of 50 caliber rounds. 8 Japanese fighters fell in minutes. None of the Hellcats went down. As the survivors limped home, they faced the bitter realization that their long-held assumptions about combat maneuvering were failing them. For the first time, the Zero's trademark agility had met an enemy that simply refused to play the same game. At Rabaul, alarm was spreading. Senior pilots who had survived multiple campaigns began warning their squadrons that this new American machine did not follow the patterns they had mastered. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanemizu, one of Japan's most experienced aces, gathered his pilots and shattered every belief they held about air combat. He told them to forget the old doctrines: turn fighting, individual duels, the reliance on instinct. The Hellcat pilots fought in pairs, in formations, as extensions of a larger system. They used radios, heavy, yes, but allowing perfect coordination. They divided altitude bands, worked in layers, and attacked in sequences rather than improvisation. Meanwhile, American pilots were entering the war with increasing skill. They trained on energy tactics designed to outpace and outclimb any opponent. The divide was widening daily. Tanemizu warned that the Japanese would have to adapt or die. But even as he spoke, the situation was slipping out of reach. Behind the front lines, a greater problem was emerging, one far more dangerous than any aircraft. Japan's pilot corps, once composed of the most elite aviators in the world, was collapsing under the weight of irreplaceable losses. Years earlier, a Japanese naval pilot entered combat with almost 700 flight hours and elite gunnery training. But fuel shortages and American pressure had forced Japan to cut corners. Young men were now being sent into battle with only 200 hours of total flying time, sometimes even less. Ammunition for practice was scarce. Night training was impossible. Many had never fired their guns except in classroom simulations. As Lieutenant Yoshihiro Hashimoto wrote, "We are sending children to fight professionals." He described new pilots showing up at the front who had never shot at a moving target, never flown at night, never practiced evasive maneuvers. Some lasted mere minutes in their first combat. At the same time, American pilots were entering the Pacific with hundreds of hours of training, extensive gunnery drills, and detailed instruction in tactics specifically built to counter Japanese maneuverability. They understood how to preserve energy, when to climb, when to dive, and how to fight as a fluid team rather than lone warriors. Every month that passed increased the gap, not just in machines but in the men who flew them. Technology was widening the divide even more. Shipboard radar allowed Hellcats to attack from unseen angles. American pilots were guided to exact positions by controllers who could track Japanese aircraft from dozens of miles away. Japanese pilots were flying blind against an enemy who could see them in the dark. One pilot described it clearly: "We were not fighting airplanes. We were fighting a system." The truth was becoming undeniable. By late 1943, the Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, It was a signal that Japan's era of air superiority was ending, piece by piece, before their eyes. October 12 to November 16, 1944. The skies over Formosa. Japan launched one of its largest defensive efforts of the war. Over 700 aircraft committed to halt the American carrier raids. For days, pilots returned claiming overwhelming victory. They believed they had sunk dozens of ships and driven the Americans back. But when gun camera footage was developed, the truth was undeniable and devastating. The Americans had lost only 89 aircraft. Japan had lost 329. Worse, most of the losses were among their last remaining veterans. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few who survived the slaughter, described the shock with painful clarity. He said the Hellcats weren't scattered or chaotic. They were arranged like a net across the sky. Layers at different altitudes, precise spacing, and timing so perfect it felt mechanical. Every climb, every dive, every ambush unfolded with mathematical predictability. When Japanese fighters tried to climb, Hellcats waited above them. When they dove, another division caught them below. Every maneuver the Zero relied on, every escape angle they had mastered, was already covered. Akamatsu said it felt less like a battle and more like being herded into a trap. And that trap would fully close 8 months later during the battle that became infamous across the world, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Japan committed 9 carriers and about 450 planes, their last chance at a decisive victory. Facing them was Task Force 58, with 15 carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and more than 450 Hellcats. It was the largest carrier battle the world had ever seen. The first Japanese strike group launched at 8:30 a.m., 69 aircraft heading straight toward radar coverage so advanced that American controllers saw them more than 150 miles away. Unlike the Japanese-American interceptors weren't scrambling blindly. Hellcats were vectored directly into perfect firing positions. The sun at their backs, altitude advantage locked in, angles calculated for maximum lethality. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escorting Zero formation, had only a few seconds of warning. He saw the Hellcats stacked in towering layers above him, waiting like a wall of steel. Every advantage was theirs, he later wrote. What followed was swift and merciless. The American fighters used energy tactics exactly as they'd been trained: dive, fire, climb, never linger. Zeros trying to turn with them stalled out and became helpless targets. Hellcats coming down from altitude shredded the formations with blistering firepower. Within 12 minutes, 42 Japanese aircraft were gone. No Hellcats were lost. Later waves met the same fate. By day's end, Japan had lost more than 350 carrier planes, essentially its entire air arm. The pilots, many barely trained, never stood a chance. It was at this battle that stunned American aviators coined the nickname the Turkey Shoot. Targets were so helpless it felt like hunting birds rather than dogfighting. This collapse was more than numbers, it was psychological. Japan's remaining pilots realized the truth. They were no longer fighting Americans, they were fighting an entire interconnected machine. Radar, tactics, training, production, discipline. The Hellcat wasn't just beating them in combat, it was erasing their air force from existence. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By now, Japan's air arm was a shadow of what it had once been, but the surviving pilots pushed on, knowing every mission might be their last. It was during this battle that Commander David Mack Campbell, already one of America's greatest aviators, achieved a record that would never be matched. Leading just 7 Hellcats from the carrier Essex, Maxey Campbell intercepted a massive Japanese formation, around 60 aircraft heading toward the American fleet. What followed was a demonstration of total air dominance. For 90 minutes, the sky filled with slashing dives, zoom climbs, and precise bursts of .50 caliber fire. Mack Campbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 fighters, 4 bombers, until he literally ran out of ammunition. His wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. 7 Hellcats had defeated 60 attackers without a single loss. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't just pilot skill. It revealed something deeper. Japan's air force had collapsed in both experience and doctrine. The remaining pilots were rushed into combat with barely 50 to 60 hours of training. Some had never fired their guns in the air before their first real mission. Meanwhile, American pilots entered battle with extensive training, thousands of practice rounds fired, and carrier landings drilled until they were instinct. By early 1945, Japan's pilot shortage was so severe that the majority of new aviators were teenagers with barely a week of flight time. Many had learned in gliders. Most had never flown at night or practiced team tactics. They were being sent to fight professionals, and against Hellcats that was a death sentence. Then came the Okinawa campaign, April to June 1945. Japan launched nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties, a desperate attempt to halt the American fleet. And it was the Hellcat that stood between those suicide pilots and the ships below. Using tight formations and coordinated sweeps known informally as the mowing machine, Hellcats shot down the majority of attacking aircraft before they ever reached the fleet. The numbers are staggering. Hellcats flew 38,000 combat sorties around Okinawa. They claimed 2,351 victories. They lost just 249 aircraft, and they prevented roughly 80% of kamikaze attacks from hitting American ships. By this stage, Japanese pilots weren't just outmatched technologically, they were psychologically defeated. Many of them described a feeling of hopelessness, what historians later called Hellcat psychosis. They understood that meeting a Hellcat in the sky meant almost certain death. Even legends were not immune. Saburō Sakai, Japan's most respected surviving ace, encountered Hellcats in 1944. Despite 200 combat missions of experience, he wrote later that the Hellcat followed every maneuver he knew, almost effortlessly. He survived only because the American pilot forgot to drop his fuel tank, making the aircraft sluggish. Skill alone couldn't bridge the new technological gap. By 1945, the Hellcat had become more than an aircraft. It was the symbol of a brutal truth. Japan wasn't losing because its pilots lacked courage. It was losing because it could no longer compete with the industrial, tactical, and technological power behind the Hellcat. When you're ready for Section 5, just say, at a post-war symposium in 1962, American ace David Mack Campbell stated plainly, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War." Saburō Sakai, the surviving Japanese ace, didn't argue. He simply said the Zero was a masterpiece of flying, and the Hellcat was a masterpiece of war. Japan's pilots had entered the war with conviction that skill and spirit were enough. The Hellcat proved otherwise. When Sakai was asked near the end of his life what the Hellcat meant to him, his answer was brutally honest. The Zero had made Japan believe in its own myth. The Hellcat shattered that myth. And in the end, he said, every Japanese pilot who survived did so because a Hellcat pilot chose not to finish the kill. Nothing captures the imbalance more clearly. The F6F Hellcat didn't just outfly the Zero. It didn't just outperform it. It dismantled an entire worldview. It was the instrument that ended Japan's dominance, broke its pilot corps, neutralized its carriers, and ushered in a new era of air warfare, an era defined not by lone aces, but by industrial power, coordinated doctrine, and machines built to win wars, not duels. The Japanese laughed at the Hellcat when they first heard of it. It was heavy, it was inelegant, it violated everything they believed about air combat. But the Hellcat had the last word, it always did.